You don't sit here unless you've actually built something. The words landed sharp and deliberate, cutting through the low hum of clinking glasses and polite laughter like they didn't belong in a room this expensive, this curated, this controlled. Conversation slowed, then stalled. Heads turned, not all at once, but enough to shift the energy. At a long, white linen table positioned just 10 feet from the stage, Ethan Whitmore stood with one hand resting on the back of a velvet chair, his smile thin, practiced, and unmistakably dismissive. Across from him, Claire Whitmore watched with a composed expression that barely masked the quiet satisfaction in her eyes, the kind that came from believing the room was already on their side. And in that chair, the one Ethan's fingers had just tightened around, sat Darius Cole. He didn't look like the loudest man in the room. He wasn't dressed for attention. Dark jeans, a fitted black shirt, no watch flashing under the lights, no entourage, no introduction. Just presence. Still, grounded, deliberate. He didn't stand. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look surprised. He simply adjusted his posture slightly, as if settling deeper into the seat that had suddenly become the center of a silent standoff. Ethan let out a short laugh, glancing around for approval that came in the form of subtle nods and a few uncomfortable smiles from nearby guests who didn't want to be involved but didn't want to oppose him either. This table's reserved, Ethan added, voice lower now, but no less sharp. For founders, investors, people who actually belong here. The word belong lingered in the air longer than it should have. Claire leaned in slightly, her tone softer but just as pointed. I'm sure there's another section for general guests, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the venue where the lighting dimmed and the tables lost their polished edge. A few people shifted in their seats. A man across the table cleared his throat but said nothing. A server paused mid-step, sensing the tension without understanding its weight. Darius finally lifted his eyes, not in defiance, not in anger, but with a calm that didn't match the situation unfolding around him. It was the kind of calm that didn't ask for permission, the kind that didn't need validation. I'm good right here, he said, voice even, unhurried, as if the conversation hadn't already crossed a line no one wanted to name out loud. Ethan's smile tightened. That wasn't the response he expected. Not resistance without emotion. Not confidence without explanation. He pulled the chair back an inch, subtle, but intentional. You're making this awkward, he said. Don't do that. But the awkwardness wasn't coming from Darius. It was spreading outward, rippling through the table, creeping into the corners of the room where people pretended not to watch. Claire crossed her arms now, her patience thinning. Can someone get staff? She said, just loud enough to be heard beyond their table. And still, Darius didn't move. Not an inch. Not a glance toward security. Not a flicker of doubt. He just sat there, steady, composed, like a man who had seen this moment before and knew exactly how it ended. The room did not recover after that moment. It only adjusted, like a surface pretending to stay smooth while something underneath had already cracked, and as the seconds stretched, the quiet shifted from polite to pressured, the kind that made people glance at each other without speaking, wondering who would step in first and how far this would go before it broke completely. And near the edge of the table, a young event assistant named Lily Carter stood frozen with a tablet in her hands, her eyes flicking from Ethan to Darius and back again, as if she were watching two different versions of reality collide in real time, because she recognized the name, not from conversation, not from introductions, but from the investor briefing she had memorized just hours earlier, the one that listed primary financial backers in bold print, the one name highlighted above all others, Darius Cole, and yet her voice did not come out, not yet, because the room was still leaning toward power it thought. It understood, and Ethan clearly felt that control tightening around him as he straightened his jacket and glanced toward the stage where the evening's main presentation was minutes away. Look, he said, lowering his tone but not his authority. We have people coming to this table who matter, so let us not make this into something it does not need to be. And Claire nodded slightly, her posture sharpening as she added, there are assigned sections for a reason, and this one is not for confusion. The word confusion landing like a softer version of something. Much harsher, something unspoken but fully understood, and still Darius did not move, his hands resting loosely against the table as if the weight of the moment did not belong to him at all, as if he were simply observing a pattern unfold. one he had seen too many times to misread. And across the room a few guests began whispering more openly now, one man leaning toward another saying, "Who is that guy?" While a woman nearby murmured, "He does not seem lost," but no one said it loud enough to shift the balance. Not yet, and Lily felt that hesitation pressing into her chest, because she knew exactly what was about to happen if no one spoke. She had seen the hierarchy charts, the ownership breakdowns, the silent structures behind the polished surface of events like this, and she knew that this was not just a seat, not just a table, it was a line being drawn in real time. And on the wrong side of it stood the very person who made this entire night possible. But fear held her still, fear of being wrong, fear of speaking out of turn, fear of challenging people who carried themselves like decisions were already made before anyone else entered the room. And then Ethan exhaled sharply, the patience in his voice thinning into something closer to irritation. "Security does not need to make this a scene," he said, though his eyes suggested that a scene might already be exactly what he wanted. "Just stand up, and we can all move on." And that was when Darius finally shifted, not to rise, not to comply, but to lift his gaze fully, meeting Ethan's eyes with a calm that did not bend, a calm that did not ask, a calm that carried something heavier than the moment itself, something rooted deeper than the room could yet understand. And when he spoke again, his voice was just as even as before, but now it carried a quiet finality. "I am not the one making this a scene," he said, and for the first time since this began, the room did not just watch, it listened. The air tightened after his words, not because they were loud, but because they refused to bend, and that refusal did something to the room that no raised voice ever could. It forced people to confront what they were watching without the comfort of pretending it was unclear, and Ethan felt it first, that subtle shift where confidence no longer echoed back the same way, where the quiet agreement he expected began to fracture into hesitation, but instead of stepping back he leaned further in, doubling down on a position that had already begun to slip. "You are sitting at a table reserved for people with actual stakes in this event," he said, his tone sharpening with each word as if precision could replace certainty. "This is not open seating." And Claire followed immediately, her voice calm but edged with something colder. "We worked for this spot. It is not something you just walk into." And there it was again, that line drawn without saying it directly, that assumption dressed up as policy, and across the table a man in a navy suit shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his phone as if searching for an exit from the moment without physically leaving it, while another guest leaned back, slightly, distancing himself from the tension without speaking against it, because silence felt safer than correction. And near the edge of the scene Lily's grip tightened around her tablet, her heart beating faster now, because the longer this continued the worse it would land. When the truth finally surfaced, she could already see the outcome forming, not in guesses but in facts she had read and memorized, and still she hesitated, because speaking now would not just correct a mistake, it would expose everyone who had chosen to watch instead of act. And then came the next layer, quieter but sharper, the kind that did not need volume to cut. Claire tilted her head slightly and said, "Are you part of the catering team, or did someone assign you to this table by mistake?" Her tone polished, almost polite, but the meaning unmistakable, and a few nearby guests exhaled softly, the kind of reaction that acknowledged the line had been crossed without stepping in to redraw it. And Darius let the question settle, not reacting immediately, not offering the correction they expected, because he was not responding to the words themselves. He was watching the pattern, the escalation, the steady climb from assumption to accusation, from discomfort to dismissal. And he had seen this climb before, years earlier in rooms smaller than this, in spaces where opportunity was promised but access was quietly controlled, where he had been asked for credentials no one else had to show, where he had been told to wait while others walked past without question. And that memory flickered through him not as anger but as clarity, a reminder of how predictable this moment really was. And when he finally spoke again, his voice remained steady, almost measured against the rising tension around him. "No one made a mistake," he said, and the simplicity of that sentence landed heavier than anything said before, because it did not argue, it did not defend, it did not explain, it simply rejected the premise entirely. And that was when Ethan's composure cracked just enough to show through. his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the event staff now gathering at a distance, drawn in by the shift in tone. "Then you need to move," he said, more forceful now, less controlled. "Because you are not supposed to be here." And for the first time, the room felt it. Not just tension, but a threshold. The moment where this stopped being a misunderstanding and became something else entirely. Something deliberate, something public, something that would not quietly disappear once the night moved on. And still, Darius did not stand. The line had been crossed, and everyone in the room knew it, even if no one had said it out loud yet. And that was the moment Lily Carter could no longer stay still, because the weight of what she knew had become heavier than the fear of speaking. And before she could second-guess herself again, she stepped forward from the edge of the table, her voice not loud but clear enough to cut through the tension. "Wait," she said, and the single word shifted just enough attention to her that the momentum paused, not broken, but interrupted, and Ethan turned toward her with a look that carried both annoyance and expectation, the kind reserved for someone he assumed would support him, not challenge him. "This is being handled," he said quickly, already trying to close the door she had just opened. But Lily did not step back, her grip on the tablet steady now even as her heart raced. I think there is a mistake," she continued, choosing her words carefully but not retreating, and Claire let out a quiet exhale, her patience thinning into something sharper. "We already established that," she replied, her tone clipped. "He is in the wrong section." But Lily shook her head slightly, her eyes flicking briefly to Darius before returning to the couple. "No, I recognize the name," she said, and that was enough to ripple through the immediate space around them. Not a full shift, but a crack in the certainty that had been building, and Ethan's expression tightened just enough to show that this was no longer moving exactly the way he had planned. "Recognize from where?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged now, and Lily hesitated for half a second, not because she doubted what she knew, but because she understood what saying it would do, how it would flip the room in an instant, how it would expose not just a mistake, but a pattern. And still, she was not ready to fully say it. Not yet. So instead she added, "From the event files, the investor list." And that word landed differently, heavier, more dangerous to the version of reality that had been dominating the table. And for a moment no one spoke, because investor was not a casual label in a room like this. It was hierarchy, it was power, it was the difference between being welcomed and being escorted out. And Claire's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not into belief, but into calculation, as if she were quickly reassessing whether this was something to dismiss or something to contain. "There are a lot of names on that list," she said, her voice smoother now, but carrying a trace of tension underneath. "That does not mean anything." But Lily did not retreat this time, her voice gaining just enough strength to hold its ground. "This one does," she said, and now more. People were listening, not pretending not to, not looking away, but leaning in slightly, because the certainty that had once filled the space was beginning to thin, and Ethan let out a short breath, glancing briefly around the table, as if measuring how much control he still had over the narrative. "You are overstepping," he said, but the words no longer carried the same weight they had just moments ago, and through all of it, Darius remained exactly where he had been, unmoved, unbothered, watching the shift not with surprise, but with the quiet patience of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment, not for someone to defend him, but for the truth to begin surfacing on its own. And as the room hovered between doubt and realization, Lily finally looked directly at him again, her voice softer now, but no longer uncertain. "Sir, can you confirm your name?" she asked, and the question hung in the air like a turning point, because everyone at that table understood that whatever came next would not just answer her question, it would redefine everything that had just happened. The question did not rush him, it did not corner him, it simply waited. And in that waiting the entire room seemed to lean forward without moving, because now it was no longer about a seat. It was about identity, about confirmation, about whether everything that had just unfolded would hold or collapse under a single answer. And Darius let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle, his eyes moving briefly across the table, not searching for approval, not looking for allies, but observing, measuring, recognizing the same expressions he had seen years ago in rooms far less polished but built on the same assumptions. And for a moment something older surfaced, not in his face but behind his eyes, a memory from a different night, a different room, when he was 22 years old standing at the entrance of a private networking event in Chicago, wearing a press shirt he could barely afford and holding a printed invitation that had been checked 3 times before he even got there, only to be stopped at the door by a man who barely glanced at the paper before saying, "This event is for founders and investors," as if those words alone were enough to erase him, as if belonging could be decided by a look instead of a fact. And he remembered standing there, not arguing, not raising his voice, just watching as others walked past him without question. People who had not built what he had already started building. People who had not carried the same weight to get there. And he remembered the feeling, not anger, not even embarrassment, but clarity, the kind that settles deep and stays, the kind that says this is not new, this is not random, this is a system repeating itself in different rooms with different faces, and that same clarity returned now as he looked back at Lily, at Ethan, at Claire, at the table that had decided who he was before asking who he might be. And when he finally spoke, his voice did not rise, it did not sharpen, it remained exactly what it had been from the start, steady, grounded, undeniable. "Darius Cole," he said, and the name moved through the space differently than anything else had, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like a key turning in a lock that had been resisting the truth up until that moment. And Lily's breath caught just slightly as the confirmation aligned with everything she had seen in the files, the highlighted line, the primary capital contributor, the name attached to the funding structure that made the entire event possible, and she did not need to say it out loud for it to begin registering across the room, because recognition does not always arrive with sound. Sometimes it arrives in the way people stop moving, in the way expressions shift from certainty to calculation, in the way silence becomes heavier instead of lighter, and Ethan felt it, even if he did not fully understand it yet, his posture adjusting just enough to show that something had changed. "That does not mean anything," he said quickly, too quickly, as if speed could outrun implication. But Claire did not speak this time, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Darius more closely now, not as an interruption, not as a mistake, but as a variable she had not accounted for. And around them the room no longer felt like it was watching a disruption. It felt like it was watching something unfold, something larger than a misunderstanding, something that had just crossed from assumption into consequence. And still, Darius did not move from the chair. The name did not echo, it settled, and in that settling the room began to reorganize itself in ways no one had planned, because now it was no longer about whether he belonged. It was about whether they had just misjudged someone they could not afford to misjudge, and Lily took a step back without realizing it, her role shifting from uncertain observer to silent confirmation of something much larger than the moment itself, while Ethan stood there holding on to a version of control that was slipping faster than he could recalibrate. "I have never heard of you," he said, forcing a short laugh that did not quite land. "And I know every investor involved tonight." But the confidence in his voice was no longer shared by the room. It was isolated, standing alone without the quiet agreement it once carried. And Claire felt that shift more clearly than he did, her silence now sharper than her earlier words, her eyes scanning the table, the nearby guests, the subtle reactions that were no longer neutral, because people were beginning to connect the dots in their own minds, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the energy from dismissal to doubt. And Darius watched it happen without interruption, without urgency, because this part did not require him to speak louder. It required him to let the truth unfold at its own pace. And after a brief moment he reached into his pocket, not quickly, not defensively, but with the same calm precision he had carried from the beginning, pulling out his phone and unlocking it with a single motion, the screen lighting up in his hand as he scrolled once before stopping, then placing the phone face up on the table between them, not sliding it, not presenting it like evidence, simply setting it there as if it belonged. And for a second no one leaned in. No one wanted to be the first to look, because looking meant acknowledging that this might already be out of their control. And finally Lily stepped closer, her eyes dropping to the screen where a familiar document layout appeared. The same investor briefing she had reviewed earlier, The same structured list of names and allocations. And there it was, not imagined, not misread, but clear, Darius Cole listed at the top under primary capital, and her breath caught again, not from surprise this time, but from confirmation, and she did not need to announce it because her reaction alone was enough to signal the shift, and that was when others leaned in. Subtle at first, a glance, a tilt of the head, a quiet recognition. Spreading like a ripple across the table, and Ethan's expression tightened further as he realized the room was no longer anchored to his version of events. That could be anything, he said, but the words sounded thinner now, less certain, as if even he could hear the gap between what he was saying and what was becoming obvious. And Claire finally spoke again, her voice lower, more controlled, but carrying something new underneath it, something closer to caution than confidence. Ethan, she said quietly, not correcting him, but not supporting him either, and that hesitation was enough, because in rooms like this, hesitation speaks louder than agreement, and across the venue a subtle change began to take shape. Staff members whispering near the stage, a coordinator glancing toward the table with a furrowed brow, someone checking a tablet twice instead of once, because the name had started moving beyond the table now, beyond the immediate circle, into the structure of the event itself, and Darius leaned back slightly in his chair, not claiming space, not asserting dominance, simply existing in it as if it had always been his. And when he spoke again, his voice carried no urgency, no need to prove, only a quiet statement that landed with the weight of inevitability. You should probably check again, he said, and this time, no one dismissed it. The shift did not arrive with noise. It arrived with attention, the kind that pulls every loose thread tight at once. And across the room a voice from the stage began to rise, smooth and rehearsed, unaware for a moment that the energy had already changed. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention, the host said, standing beneath the soft wash of overhead lights, holding a tablet in one hand and a smile that had not yet adjusted to what was unfolding 10 feet away, and gradually. Conversations faded, chairs angled forward, eyes lifted, but not all of them, because a growing number remained fixed on the table where something quieter and far more consequential was taking shape, and the host continued. Tonight is not just about innovation. It is about partnership, about vision, about the people who make these ideas possible. And as those words carried through the room, they began to land differently, heavier, almost ironic, because the very person being described was still sitting in a chair that had just been challenged, and Ethan felt it now, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that the moment was slipping beyond his control, his earlier certainty replaced with a tightening awareness that something larger was aligning against him. And Claire stood still beside him, her posture composed but her eyes fixed on the stage, because she understood before he did that this was no longer about a private misunderstanding. It was about to become public, and at the edge of the table Lily did not move, her gaze shifting between Darius and the host, as if she could already see the connection forming, the final piece about to fall into place. And then the host glanced down at the tablet, scanning the next line with a slight pause. The kind that happens when the name carries weight even before it is spoken. We would like to take a moment, he said, his tone lifting slightly, to recognize the lead investor whose support made tonight possible. And that was when the room truly stilled, not in anticipation of a name, but in the realization that the moment had arrived, and the host continued. A visionary who has backed more than 40 early-stage ventures across the country and continues to shape the future of this industry. And a few guests nodded, recognizing the description even before the name came, while others leaned in, curious, attentive, unaware that the answer was already sitting among them. And Ethan's eyes flicked toward the stage, then back to Darius, then back again, the pieces beginning to align too late, while Claire's breath slowed, her expression tightening just enough to reveal what she had already concluded. And then the host spoke the name, clear, confident, unmistakable, Mr. Darius Cole. And the effect was immediate, not explosive, but absolute, like a switch, flipping in the collective awareness of the room. And for a fraction of a second no one moved, because recognition does not always create sound. Sometimes it creates silence first, the kind that forces everything to reset at once. And then heads turned, not randomly, but deliberately, toward the table where Darius still sat, exactly where he had been from the beginning. And in that moment the narrative that had been built around him collapsed without resistance, because it had never been grounded in truth. And Ethan stood frozen, the confidence that had once filled his posture now replaced with something far less certain, something closer to disbelief. While Claire lowered her gaze for the first time, not out of shame yet, but out of calculation, reassessing a situation that had already moved beyond correction, and Darius did not stand immediately. He did not rush to claim the recognition being placed on him. He simply remained seated for one more second, allowing the weight of the moment to fully settle across the room. And when he finally rose, it was not abrupt, not dramatic, just deliberate, the kind of movement that does not ask for attention because it already has it. And as the first wave of applause began to build, uneven at first then stronger, more certain, he looked briefly at Ethan and Claire, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. And in a voice just loud enough for them to hear, he said, "You were right about one thing." A slight pause, just enough to let the words land. "This seat does matter." The applause did not rise all at once. It built in layers, uneven at first, hesitant, as if the room needed a second to catch up with what had just happened. And then it grew stronger, fuller, because recognition had replaced assumption. And in rooms like this, recognition always wins. And as Darius stepped forward from the table, the space around him opened without being asked, chairs shifting slightly, bodies turning, people making room not out of courtesy, but out of recalibrated understanding. And the same voices that had been silent minutes ago now found energy in approval, in alignment, in the safety of being on the right side of the moment. And the host extended a hand toward him with a smile that now carried a different kind of respect, one grounded in awareness rather than introduction, while just behind, the table that had been the center of tension stood frozen in contrast. Ethan no longer speaking, no longer directing, his earlier certainty replaced by a stillness that did not look like control anymore. It looked like realization arriving too late. And Claire stood beside him, her posture still composed, but her gaze lowered now, not in submission but in calculation that had run out of time. Because there are moments when repositioning is no longer possible, when the narrative has already shifted beyond recovery, and around them the subtle movements said everything. A guest who had nodded along earlier now avoided eye contact. Another who had remained neutral now leaned slightly away, distancing himself from the side of the table that had just lost its footing, and Lily stood a few steps back, watching it all unfold. With a quiet exhale, the tension she had carried finally releasing into something steadier, because the truth had surfaced without her needing to force it any further. And on the stage Darius accepted the microphone, not rushing, not performing, just stepping into the role that had always been his whether the room recognized it or not. And before he spoke he let the room settle again, not commanding silence, but allowing it to return naturally, because control does not always come from volume. Sometimes it comes from timing. And when he began, his voice carried clearly, evenly, without strain. "Thank you," he said, simple, direct, and the room responded not just with more applause, but with attention that now held. Because this was no longer background noise. This was the center, and he paused briefly, just enough to let the moment breathe before continuing. "It is interesting," he added, his tone calm, but deliberate, "how quickly people decide who belongs in a space before they know who helped build it." And the words did not accuse, they did not name, but they landed exactly where they needed to, because everyone in the room knew what they were connected to, and a subtle shift moved through the audience again, not discomfort, but awareness, the kind that stays longer than the moment itself. And Darius glanced briefly back toward the table, not lingering, not calling anyone out, just enough to acknowledge what had happened without turning it into spectacle. And then he continued, "Tonight is about opportunity, about vision, about recognizing value where others might overlook it." And his voice remained steady, grounded in something deeper than the event itself, something shaped long before this room existed. And the truth is, the future is not built by the loudest voice at the table. It is built by the people who understand what that table is actually worth. And that line settled into the room like a quiet conclusion, not dramatic, not forced, but complete. And as the applause returned, stronger now, more unified, It no longer felt like a reaction. It felt like agreement. While back at the table, Ethan finally stepped back half a step, not pushed, not forced, just moved by the weight of everything that had just shifted, and Claire remained still for a moment longer before following, both of them no longer at the center of anything, just part of the background that had once tried to define the moment. And in that contrast, without a single raised voice or public confrontation, everything had already been decided. The applause lingered even after Darius stepped away from the microphone, not because he demanded it, but because the room needed a moment longer to recalibrate itself around what had just been revealed. And as conversations slowly resumed, they carried a different tone now, quieter, more measured, as if everyone had become more aware of how quickly perception could fail them when it relied on assumption instead of truth. And across the floor small clusters began forming, people exchanging glances, revisiting what they had just witnessed, some nodding in quiet respect, others shaking their heads at how easily the situation had escalated before anyone paused to question it. And at the center of it all, the table that had once drawn attention for the wrong reason now faded into the background, no longer a focal point, just a reminder, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, his posture no longer rigid, no longer leading, just present, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular as the weight of the evening settled in, not as a single mistake, but as a series of choices made too quickly, too confidently, and Claire beside him exhaled slowly, her expression composed but no longer certain, because there are moments when understanding arrives without warning, not through confrontation but through contrast, and this had been one of them, and neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything said now would sound smaller than what had already been revealed without words. And a few seats away, Lily finally allowed herself to sit, placing the tablet gently on the table as she looked toward the stage once more, her expression steady, reflective, because she had seen both sides of the moment unfold in real time, the assumption and the correction, the silence and the shift, and she understood now how thin the line between them really was. And near the stage, Darius spoke quietly with a small group of organizers, his presence unchanged from before, still calm, still grounded, not elevated by the recognition, but simply placed where it had always belonged. And that was the part that lingered most, not the applause, not the reveal, but the way he had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to prove himself beyond being exactly who he was. And as the evening continued, the energy of the room settled into something more honest, less performative, as if the illusion had been stripped away just enough to remind everyone what actually mattered. And after a while Darius made his way back toward the table, not to reclaim it, not to make a statement, but simply to pass through. And as he did, Ethan finally looked up, their eyes meeting for a brief second, not long enough for a conversation, not long enough for resolution, but long enough for recognition. And in that moment Darius gave a small nod, not of approval, not of dismissal, just acknowledgement, the kind that does not carry judgment, but does not ignore what happened either. And then he continued walking, leaving the space behind him exactly as it was, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through confrontation, not through consequence, but through clarity. And by the time the night came to a close, the story that remained was not about a seat, or a table, or even a single moment of misunderstanding. It was about something deeper, something quieter, something that would follow each person out of that room long after the lights dimmed. The understanding that respect is not something granted by appearance, and dignity is not something that needs permission. And as the doors opened and guests began to step back into the city night, carrying their conversations with them, one truth stayed with those who had witnessed it, clear, simple, and impossible to ignore, that real power does not announce itself, it reveals itself, and when it does not need to raise its voice, it raises the standard.